Everyone, I'm Patricia Shampton, Director of Alumni Relations for Texas Exes, and thank you for joining us for the September Lunchtime Lecture. And thanks again to our wonderful sponsor, Home Chef, for making this event possible for Longhorns all around the world. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Weber. Dr. Weber is the Josey Centennial Professor in Energy Resources and a Professor of Mechanical Engineering at UT Austin, where he teaches and conducts research at the convergence of engineering, policy, and commercialization. He has authored more than 500 scientific articles, columns, books, chapters, including op-ed in the New York Times and features in Scientific American. His book, Power Trip, The Story of Energy, which received a glowing review by the New York Times, was published in 2019. An award-winning 6-part companion series for the book aired on PBS starting Earth Day 2020 and has reached over 1 million viewers. Please welcome Dr. Weber.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate the welcome, the opportunity to speak with some of my fellow alumni. Just a quick opening. I know you've got other lunchtime lectures coming up, but also wanted to tell you about, if I can get the slides to work, some upcoming short courses through Texas Engineering Executive Education. A couple of courses that I'll be co-teaching or co-taught by people from my research group. We got an upcoming course on Introduction to Energy Technology Policy, an upcoming course on hydrogen, which we'll talk about both of those a little bit today, and also a course taught by Dr. Josh Rhodes called Too Big to Excel on energy data analytics. So if you want more educational content, University of Texas is here to provide through Texas Exes, but as well as Texie. So really happy to potentially see some faces here today, but also as a part of that course. So let me sort of shut out of this. Let's see if I can switch my presentations real quick as I navigate the technology to go from PowerPoint to Keynote. And hopefully everyone can see a title slide. This is Global Energy Trends and Transition. So I'm going to walk through kind of big picture on energy. I have something like 80 plus slides. It'll take about 30 to 40 minutes to get through it, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A. And I'm going to walk through kind of my view on energy. And you heard some of the introduction to who I am. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering. I'm at my office at the University of Texas right now in ETC, the Engineering Teaching Center. I was an undergrad at UT. I studied Plan 2 and aerospace engineering. And most importantly, I was in the Longhorn Band. And some of my Longhorn Band colleagues and college roommates are here listening today, I think. So they'll probably heckle me in Q&A and chat. So hang tight for that. I'm sure it will be entertaining. And let me see if I can get my slides to work. I'm just going to walk you through my view. The first point I want to share with you, and this is really just Michael Weber view, is that energy is like magic. That energy gives us a magical ability to do things that are interesting and useful. And if you want to sort of look to other people who might say that, not just me, Richard Feynman, a Nobel laureate, said, it is important to realize that in physics today, we have no knowledge of what energy is. And that's really a fascinating thing. And as a person who teaches thermodynamics and teaches energy classes, I have to say we can anticipate energy. We can manipulate energy, we can evaluate what it might do or what its impacts are, but we can't really say exactly what it is other than some sort of generic expression that it's the ability to do work or the ability to do things that are useful and interesting. We don't really know what it is at its most fundamental level, and that makes it kind of magical. In fact, if you look at the way energy is reflected in our popular culture, it's often presented in kind of a magical way. So here's a scene of Mickey Mouse dancing from Fantasia. If you've seen this movie, this is the Sorcerer's Apprentice scene. And here, Mickey, the apprentice, was given the chore to fetch water. And a bucket of water, which is like 2.5 gallons, weighs like 20 pounds. So 2 buckets of water, but like 40 pounds. It's a very burdensome chore. And so Mickey decides to use magic to do the chore for him. And he casts a spell on the broom, and the broom does a chore for him. But then the brooms start to multiply, and then mayhem ensues. And then the sorcerer has to solve the problem. But I guess the point here is the chore of lifting water from the well down below up many flights of steps to where you need it is very difficult. And so Mickey wants to use magic. Well, today we use electric pumps to do that work for us. We use energy to replace the magic from Mickey Mouse. Another example of this is the myth of the unicorn. So some of you are familiar with unicorns. For the Austin tech audience, or maybe some of you in the Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, when you hear unicorn, you probably think of a tech startup worth $1 billion. But when I say unicorn, I mean the mythical one-horned animal whose myth really emerged in the Indus River Valley centuries ago. It was immortalized in a series of tapestries in France and elsewhere. And the key thing about the unicorn is not just that it's rare or beautiful, although it is rare and beautiful, it's that its horn had the almost magical ability to treat water, to rid a stream of its poison or toxicity. In fact, in one of these tapestries, the unicorn's dipping its horn into the water to treat it. Well, today, we use energy to treat water to make it safe to drink. So we replace the magic of the mythical unicorn horn with modern energy. Another way this shows up in popular culture is with Tantalus, the Greek figure who misbehaved, and he was punished with eternal thirst and hunger by the Greek gods, and he was placed in a pond whose water in fig tree would recede out of reach. He'd reach up for a fig and the branch would bend out of reach. He'd bend down for a drink of water and the pond would recede out of reach. And this is where we get the word tantalize, which means food and water just out of reach. Well, today we use abundant energy to bring water within reach through long haul piping and pumping and treatment and desalination and things like that. Or we use modern energy to make food abundant and accessible. So you could say we're using modern energy to overcome the power of the Greek gods to bring food and water within reach. That's one more example. And then there's, of course, the medieval alchemists who would take abundant and worthless materials, say lead or straw or hair or something like that, and turn it into gold. We know these stories through Rumpelstiltskin and others, but that's actually the modern day energy industry, taking something that's worth very little, crude oil, worth 20 cents per pound or less, and turning it into something that's actually worth less than lead, turning that into something worth a lot like Chanel No. 5 or pharmaceuticals, other things that are worth more than gold. So this magical medieval alchemy is a modern day continuous process at, say, a petrochemical facility or a petroleum refinery. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that we've converted these myths into reality today using the ability of energy. And I think that's kind of cool. And as an energy engineer or as a technologist in general, I like this. I want to quote Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the sci-fi writer, who said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." It's just kind of fun for me to think like, okay, I'm a technologist, and therefore what I do might be magical, and energy and magic and technology all go hand in hand. So this is all just kind of preamble that I think energy is kind of awesome, and I think we should look into it, but it's not just magical and potentially useful. It is actually directly good. That energy enables things for us. It gives us abundant food and clean water and productive industry, a growing economy, mobility, comfortable buildings. Right now, I've got my air conditioning on in my UT office, although we're having a cold front in Austin, so it's only 88 degrees or something like that after a heat dome of 75 days that hit Texas. It's really nice to have air conditioning and these modern energy-powered conveniences to make our life better and more comfortable. And we can even track this, at least for the correlation, in terms of wealth and energy consumption. Across this bottom axis is energy consumption per person in million BTU per year. BTU is a British thermal unit. 1 BTU is about the equivalent energy of a kitchen match. And if you look in places like the United States, we consume over 300 million kitchen matches of energy per person per year. And then on the vertical axis is the GDP, or the economic activity per person in PPP, which is purchasing power parity in 2005 thousands of dollars. So the 2005 GDP, or economic activity per American, was over $40,000. If you normalize that for inflation and things like that, to today, it'd be even more, that'd be greater. But this is like, think of that as wealth going up and down and energy going across the right. And there's nominally this correlation that the more energy you consume, the richer you get, or the richer you get, the more energy you consume. And the causation is not really obvious because they're related, but you could say that in the bottom left-hand corner, if you increase access to energy, you will get richer. At some point, as you get richer, you will increase your consumption of energy, which will make you richer yet again. But at some point, it wears off. If you look over on the far right, you get countries like Bahrain and Iceland who consume a lot of energy because it's really cold or really hot, or because the energy is sort of spilling out of the ground with geothermal heat or oil and gas that's available for cheap and free. They consume a lot of energy, but they're not as rich as we are in the United States. In the United States, we consume a lot more energy than, say, our European sort of compatriots, so to speak, people in other developed countries. We consume a lot more energy, but we're not as rich as that. Like, we're not twice as rich, even though we consume twice as much energy. So there's correlation, but it's not perfect, but something to keep in mind, that energy consumption and affluence seem to go hand in hand. I would take it a step farther and say, actually, energy consumption and democracy or freedom go hand in hand. Here's the International Space Station headed over Southeast Asia, and that was the Korean Peninsula. South Korea all lit up, and in North Korea dark. So we could go a step farther and say, if you don't have access to energy, then you might be living an unfree life in an autocratic country. So we need to think about it that as well. So I think energy is good. It's also critical. It touches everything we care about. It touches every part of society. It's relevant to all the sectors we care about. You can relate to security and health and transportation and agriculture and buildings and everything else. And it's just important. So it's good. It's also critical. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. I want to introduce you to Rick Smalley, a Nobel Prize winning professor from Rice University, another Texan. He got the Nobel Prize for discovering Buckminster fullerene, or buckyballs, a carbon-60 geodesic dome-shaped structure. You can see a purple sort of mock-up of that in front of his picture. And he spent the last few years of his life, before he died in 2005, giving speeches talking about the list of the world's top 10 problems. And this is now known colloquially as Smalley's List. And this list of 10 items had a particular order to it: energy, then water, then food, the environment, poverty, terrorism and war, disease, education, democracy, and population. And he put this order to it with a logic, which is if you solve one problem, you can solve the next one. If we can solve our energy problems, if we have access to abundant, affordable, reliable, sustainable energy, then we can solve our water problems because we can drill a deeper well and lift the water higher or move it farther or desalt the oceans or treat the dirty water, whatever it is. And once you have energy and water, then you have food, because you need energy and water for food. And once you have food, you can protect the environment. It's hard to worry about the environment if you're hungry. And if you can protect the environment, you can lift people out of poverty, which prevents terrorism and war. And then you have the time to turn your attention towards disease. And then education is a precursor to democracy, because you need a well-educated population to have a well-functioning democracy. Although I submit to you that as a nation, we're testing that hypothesis right now. And then you get to population, which is 10th on the list. And this is important because a lot of environmental futurists put population much higher on that list. And he's like, no, if you really want to deal with population, you have to deal with education, because the way to deal with population is by educating people. And you can't really worry about education if you're hungry or you don't have water, you don't have energy. So you have to have a sequence. But he comes to the conclusion, and frankly, I agree, that energy is at the top of the list. That energy is the critical piece that we need to unlock to get to all the other pieces of society we care about. So this is all preamble to say that, in my view, energy is magical. It is advanced technology. It is good. It is critical. And I'm not the only one who thinks that. Other people say that, and I agree. So if we look at energy now, if we decide it's magical and good and critical and all that kind of thing, how should we look at it? And the lens to look at energy is through trade-offs. That energy done the right way makes us healthy, wealthy, and free, which is great news, but energy done the wrong way makes us sick and poor and insecure. We might as well take the time and effort to do it the right way, because doing it the wrong way has such severe downsides. Along the way, there are great inequities in global energy consumption. We don't consume energy the same way, in the same quantity, or the same forms, or for the same purposes as everyone else around the world. And if we look at this, North America at the top, if we look at 2020 statistics here, which are not that different than today, we have incredible energy consumption per person per year. That's in North America, the United States and Canada. Then you have the former Russian, sort of Soviet Union states, the Middle East, Europe, the global average, Asia Pacific, et cetera. A typical American consumes a lot more energy than the global average. And this is very important because everyone around the world would like to live life like an American, which I think is really important. And we have to sort of think about that as we move forward in our process of solving the energy system. Let me show this a different way. This is global energy consumption per capita in million BTU on the vertical axis, and across the bottom, this is population. This is as of several years ago. We're now up to 8 billion people. The world average is like 75 million BTU per person per year. In the UK, they consume twice as much as the global average, but it's only 60 million people or so. In the United States, over 300 million people, we consume twice as much as the typical British person who consumes twice as much as the global average. And then you have the Texans up there, 30 million, and we consume 60% more energy per person in Texas than in North America as a whole, which is twice as much United Kingdom and that kind of thing. So you end up thinking about a typical Texan consuming something like 6 times more energy than the global average, but being a small fraction of the population. Well, what happens if you add that up around the world? It's like 500 quads of energy, 500 quadrillion BTU consumption per year around the world. Well, if everyone in the world decided to consume like the United Kingdom, well, then you have to increase energy consumption by a couple hundred quads. Or if they all want to consume like Americans, then we have to like quadruple the energy system. And if they all want to consume like Texans, and we're talking about sort of doing more than that, multiplying by 6 or 7. And then if you add in population growth, we're talking about expanding the entire energy system by a factor of 10. So if we're going to include population growth to, I don't know, 10 or 11 billion people, and everyone consumes like Texans, that bright green is the energy consumption or energy provision we need to make available. And the shaded part is how much we're consuming today. So we can think about increasing the energy production, movement, consumption, and then mitigation of its environmental impacts by a factor of 10. That will be hard to do. I can't imagine increasing the energy sector by a factor of 10 anytime soon without having some severe downside impacts. So that's the challenge we have, is all the inequities and the trade-offs and everything else. Well, that all sets up the stage for where we are now, which is energy is going through a global transition. So I'll talk about the future a little bit, and just a reminder that it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Yogi Berra said that very famously, the funny catcher from New York Yankees. He's actually quoting quantum physicist Niels Bohr, who won the Nobel Prize. Niels Bohr used to say this 100 plus years ago, and Yogi Berra was quoting this physicist. Who knew? But this is the idea. We're going to look into the future, and it's easy to be wrong, especially in energy. So let me give examples of projections that are wrong. This is projections on energy consumption from the US government, from the Energy Information Administration, from 2006 to 2012. Our consumption have been increasing, and we just kept drawing a line showing it's going to keep going up forever out to 2030. And every year we'd like to lower our estimates. But in fact, our energy consumption has been level for about 15 years. We kept thinking energy consumption was going to grow. It didn't. We thought it was going to grow like 30% or more. And the fact that energy consumption didn't grow in the United States is primarily an efficiency story. We have more efficient cars and more efficient light bulbs, more efficient everything. And so we've had economic growth and population growth without the increases in energy consumption, which is remarkable. But it means we were also really wrong. And that mistake can be consequential because important people making important decisions about what to build are allocating capital and then the market's not really there. So this is sort of a consequential mistake in terms of overall energy consumption. So we can really blow it on the numbers, like how big the numbers will be. We can even get it wrong on the direction. So in 2006, looking forward, this is our imports of natural gas in trillion cubic feet per year. And we thought that's just going to keep growing. We need natural gas for power, for home heating, for chemicals, or all these ways we use natural gas, which are really handy. And we're like, it's going to grow forever. Let's build liquefied natural gas or LNG import terminals to improve our access to liquefied natural gas. And then by just a few years later, we had turned around from it growing to decreasing. And now it's a net negative import, which means we are exporting liquefied natural gas from Texas and Louisiana because we have an abundance of gas from the shale revolution. Look at that first outlook, 2006. The shale revolution of shale oil and gas really took off like 2007 or 2008, something like that. So before the shale revolution, we got it completely wrong, not just on the quantity of energy we consume, but the direction of the flows. And so that's an important reminder. I'm going to talk about the future. I wouldn't be surprised, and you shouldn't be surprised if I'm completely wrong. So let's use that as setup for what I'll say next. Now, what's happening right now is an energy transition, which I think is comprised of 6 demographic trends and 3 technology trends and this one grand challenge. And the 6 demographic trends are what's happening around the world, especially globally with population growth, economic growth, urbanization, industrialization, electrification, and motorization. There's more of us, and we're getting richer. And as each person comes to life, they want energy and water and food and soil and minerals and that kind of thing. And as we get richer, we want more of that per person. So it's like compounded growth or exponential growth. Then we're moving from farm to factory and from rural areas to cities. So we're moving into the cities as urbanization and industrializing. If you are energy poor, you tend to use energy for heating and cooking. But as you get access to more energy, you'll use it for industrial activities to make things, which will lead to economic growth and prosperity, which is great. And then as we become prosperous, we tend to want electricity and mobility. Electricity and mobility are the preferred fuels and services of the rich. If you're energy poor, you want cow dung, straw, and wood, or whatever you can get for heating and cooking. If you're rich, you want electricity and you want to move about. So we use the energy for different purposes, and we use it in different places. Basically, this means everything's changing. We're changing how much we use, where we use it, why we use it, what we get from it, all that kind of thing. It's a massive set of fundamental drivers of change in the energy system. Well, overlay on top of that, technology trends of decreasing resource intensity. We have more efficiency, which means we're using less mass and less energy per thing we do, per activity, per product, per service, per activity. And that's really a great news megatrend that's been underway for hundreds of years. My light bulb is much more efficient now than it was 10 years ago, for example. We also have increasing data intensity or increasing information intensity. We have more information, more sensors, more data, more bits, more things flying around. And in fact, that increasing information is one reason why we have that first trend, which is increasing efficiency, because we have more information we can use to achieve the efficiency, which is sort of a coupled trend, which is pretty exciting. And then the third trend is increasing customization or increasing decentralization or decreasing centralization. I just said the same thing 3 different ways. Instead of having one large power plant far away, we're starting to have a lot of small power plants on our rooftop with solar panels or fuel cells or natural gas generators or whatever it is to make power behind the meter. And instead of a large factory far away, we have 3D desktop printing that's making 1 million customized things instead of 1 million of the same thing. And instead of large water facilities far away, we're having more rainwater harvesting or neighborhood scale water treatment and distribution systems. And we even see it with medicine. Instead of going to the hospital, we might do telemedicine or telehealth and go to the hospital just for the real critical services we can't get through clinics or remotely. So this trend is happening not just in energy, it's happening in many things, and they're all kind of coupled together. But these 3 technology trends are happening on top of the 6 demographic trends I showed you on the prior slide. Wrap all this up, 6 demographic trends and 3 technology trends inside one 2-sided challenge, which is how do we increase energy access for the billion people who need it? There are 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity. There's another couple billion people who don't have access to reliable electricity. And then there's 1 billion to 2 billion people who don't have access to pipe water or sanitation, which is the sewage and wastewater treatment. So this is a huge problem. There are people who need access to modernity or modern resources who don't have it. And there are 7 billion of us who do have it, who need to reduce our impacts because we're just too dirty with how we do it. We got to do both. And just saying to those billion people, sorry, you don't get it, isn't really an ethical or moral or philosophically appropriate answer, but letting us just pollute nonstop also isn't appropriate. So we got to do both at the same time. And this is all what drives this energy transition, these 6 demographics, 3 technology trends, and the 2-sided challenge. And that's where we are. But I would say, don't worry, energy transitions have happened before. We've been through them. Let's walk through some of them. I'll give a couple of examples. Let's talk about fuel transitions, just changing the type of fuel we're using. We're just using United States numbers as an example. This is 1800 to 2021. The annual energy consumption on the vertical axis is in quads or quadrillion BTU. So the higher up you go, the more energy it is. And then the dates across the bottom axis. And there was an era where wood was dominant. We used wood for heating and cooking and for industrial activities, as a building material for our prairie homes and for fence posts and that kind of thing. And that was dominant until 1885, when coal became dominant. And we used coal more and more for industrial heat, especially for steel, but also for making other materials and eventually for making power for electricity. And then that was dominant until about 1950, when oil overtook it. Oil. We used oil before that for heating and industry and chemicals and things as well, but it really took off for the combustion engine. And now we're in that oil dominant era, though. If you look at the far right, coal's been dropping. Coal's dropped like 60% in the last 15 years. Renewables on the rise, nuclear is flat, natural gas on the rise, petroleum kind of bumpy or dropping. And it looks like natural gas will overtake petroleum this year, which would be pretty interesting. We'll enter the natural gas era. Who knows how long we'll be in the natural gas as dominant era. But then maybe someday in the future, renewables or nuclear will overtake natural gas as well. So this idea that we have different dominant fuels, or that the fuel mix changes with time, is not a new thing. In fact, it is a story of energy that it has been changing all the way along. And for the most part, it's been a good news story. And for example, if we just look at virgin forests in America, we had a lot of them in the 1600s. We'd cut down a lot of them by 1850. And by 1920, we had cut down almost all the old growth forests. And what happened is that coal came along and saved the forest, because coal was a better fuel, it was more energy dense. And so you got more energy per pound, but it was also cleaner. It would generate less soot and ash than burning wood. It was also closer to market. We cut down all the trees close to the eastern seaboard. And so you could get coal from West Virginia or Pennsylvania and move it over to Philadelphia and Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., the load centers or the population centers. So it was a cheaper, cleaner, closer to market, more convenient fuel than wood. And by going to coal, we quit cutting down the forest. They've actually grown back, many of them. So if you go to the upper Midwest today, or if you go to Maine, there are these incredible forests. They are all regrowth or second growth forests. They're not the original trees that were there hundreds of years ago. And that's because coal saved them, which is really incredible. Same kind of story with whales, where oil saved the whales. We used to use whale oil as an illuminant. We'd burn it in a whale oil lamp and it would smell like bacon. And we started to run out of whales. The whales became really expensive to get because we killed so many. If any of you have read Moby Dick by Herman Melville, that's all about the whaling industry, because it was so important for selling light, so to speak. Well, petroleum comes along. The production intentionally started in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And you had people like Rockefeller and others who were distilling the oil to get the kerosene out. The kerosene is the middle of the barrel, the middle distillate. And they throw away the gasoline and throw away the tar and other things, and use the kerosene as an illuminant, as a lighting fuel, because it was brighter and it was cleaner. It wouldn't smell as bad, and it was cheaper and closer to market. As we ran out of whales, oil became a solution. But this raises this incredible prospect that oil saved the whales and coal saved the forest. And today, 150 years later, we think of coal as a threat to the forest and oil as a threat to the whales, which is sort of a fascinating change of fate as time goes on. And if you look at it as a consequence, our emissions have changed. We changed our fuel mix. In the United States, our emissions peaked absolutely in sort of 2008 or so, and has dropped since then. Despite population growth and economic growth, we've been growing the economy and growing the population with less and less emissions, which is really an incredible story, partly because of these fuel substitutions and everything else that happened. So we've had fuel transitions. We've also had technology transitions. I'll give examples within lighting, and within your lifetime on this call, you've experienced that. Not all of these. We used to use candles and torches and things like that. We went from solid fuels to liquid fuels like whale oil, to natural gas and gaseous fuels, to electric fuels for the incandescent light bulb and the fluorescent light bulb, and then the light emitting diode, which is super efficient. And in fact, today, lighting, which used to be 7 or 10% of national electricity consumption, was often one of the biggest consumers in a house, is way behind refrigerators and other appliances because of these technology substitutions and fuel substitutions. We've also had transition in transportation. We went from animal power or muscle power, like walking or rowing or riding a horse. These are sort of typical transportation modes, using wind power with sailboats, eventually to steam power, burning coal primarily to get steam to eventually gasoline and then high performance gasoline and diesel and other things. So we've changed the fuels we use for transportation, and it's been a good news story. Animal power was quite filthy. Here's an image from a thaw in the streets of London where you had a lot of animal manure mixed in with the ice, and then we had the thaw. It was just disgusting, right? So it was a public health problem to have all that animal manure in the streets. And as we went from animal power to coal and gasoline, it got cleaner. We don't have that waste we're leaving behind in the streets. We're dumping it in the atmosphere instead, but it's a different kind of waste. And performance has increased along the way. The time it takes to travel the world, for example, dropped significantly from Magellan's first adventure to circumnavigate the globe to what we can do today with transmission satellites and other things. So there's an increasing performance that happens on this. And it's kind of a reminder that the energy system is just one of change. And sometimes the change can change quickly. I give as examples of wood to coal to oil to gas, which seems like it takes decades. Oh my God, it can take forever, but it can also go quickly. Let me give an example. Just the oil, it seems like all the cover articles in the early 2000s and The Economist and National Geographic are about how we're running out of oil, we're all going to die. In here, the one on the far right, after oil powering the future with a special on the bomb 60 years later, seems relevant with the movie Oppenheimer out right now. And that's not an accident that they talk about nuclear power in the same article or same issue that we talk about the end of oil, so to speak, sort of peak oil, the end of oil. We're running out of oil. Oil will not be cheap. We'll be living in barren deserts, as it says on The Economist, this kind of thing. And just a few years later, it was the other way around. We'll never run out of oil. America strikes oil. Like our mood had changed so much just because of the shale revolution and what hydraulic fracturing did to unleash the potential of domestic oil and gas resources, which is really incredible. So our moods can certainly change, and our cover articles can change quickly, despite the long timelines that can happen. So let's give some other examples of how energy changes slowly. I already talked about the fuels change slowly. Our mood can change quickly, but let's give a sort of a technological example. Today in the United States, 4 technologies are responsible for more than 60% of our energy conversion, our primary energy conversion, and that's the steam turbine, the gas turbine, the gasoline engine, and the diesel engine. And they were all invented as recently as 1893. We are running the global economy on 4 technologies that are 130 years old or older. The other 40% of primary energy conversion is mostly like burners and boilers and stoves and fireplaces, which are even older. So this is kind of a fascinating dilemma for me that we have a modern economy, we have modern forms of energy, but we're running off this 130-year-old technology. Maybe we need some new ideas. And as an engineer who thinks about this, I'm like, okay, well, how do we innovate? And I'm sure there are many innovators on this sort of webinar as well. I'd love to hear from you. Well, I say that many of the new ideas are actually not that new. So we can talk about wind or solar. Well, wind generators are first demonstrated in the late 1800s, as were solar panels with photovoltaic cells. They're not really any newer than diesel engines and other things. So that's a real challenge. We might consider something really exciting like electric vehicles, which made their debut in the 90s. And by that, I mean the 1890s. They've been around for a long time. In fact, the bus fleet in London 100 years ago was electric. And those electric cars lost out to liquid fuels because liquid fuels just had better performance features and were cheaper and easier to get and distribute and that kind of thing, at least at the time. I would say even James Prescott Joule in 1839 said, I can hardly doubt that electromagnetism will ultimately be substituted for heat or steam to propel machinery. So even Joule, for whom we have units of energy named the Joule, saw this coming not quite 200 years ago, but like 180 years ago. So we've been seeing electric cars coming for a long time. They're just now getting traction, so to speak, in the markets. And we could also try transportation and evacuated tubes. Like this is like the sort of the hyperloops, things like that that Tesla and others have talked about. Well, that was thoroughly investigated decades ago at the Rand Corporation. I worked at Rand for a few years. They did this report in August 1972, a very high-speed transit system using evacuated tubes like we see at the bank where we send our money from the drive-through all the way over to the teller, or with these habit trails with our hamsters and things like that. This idea is not new, even though Tesla might be talking about it or Elon Musk might be talking about it. We could use wind to make fuels. This is an idea that's been around for a while. Well, the Dutch talked about it in the 1700s. It's all like power to X and power to fuels. The Dutch would use these stamper mills to squeeze oil seeds to get the oil out that they could use for heating and cooking and illumination. So even using wind power to make fuels is not a new idea. We talk about hydrogen. Hydrogen's very exciting. First talked about 1839. First fuel cells demonstrated then. Hydrogen was known as a fuel before that. Jules Verne, the French author, wrote about the use of electrolyzers to make hydrogen from water and then use that hydrogen fuel cells in his book, Mysterious Island, in 1874. And if any of you are musical fans, The Phantom of the Opera, written by another French author, Gaston Leroux, he wrote it in 1910 about the Paris Opera House in the late 1800s. Well, in the Paris Opera House, he wrote about this. They use hydrogen blends with methane or natural gas to change the brightness of the stage lighting. And today we talk about doing hydrogen blending and pipelines with methane. It's some advanced technology. I'm like, okay, well, the fine arts kids in the 1800s are doing this in the Paris Opera House. So there's room for some new ideas. And I think putting this all together, the prior energy transitions offer some important lessons. One is energy transition is more typical than we might expect. We typically move towards cleaner options. We typically move towards higher performing options. We move towards cheaper options. Yesterday's solutions, coal for the forests and oil for the whales, might be tomorrow's problems. Now we're worried about oil and coal. And so whatever solutions we have today, wind or solar, whatever, might become tomorrow's problems. And we have to worry about how there isn't really a lot of new ideas. So if you have new ideas on this call, I'd love to hear them. And the transitions can take a long time, so we better get started. And I feel like there's a time sensitivity or urgency to this, so we might as well get hopping. Like let's get moving on this. Now, in my view, decarbonizing the global economy is important and urgent. Like we have to do it, and we have to do it quickly. The time matters. If we take 100 years to do it, that will be less beneficial and very deadly to humanity than if we did it quickly. So let's get moving. And then it's worth asking, what is the priority order for doing this? Like, what are the steps we should take? And here are the 4 priority steps in my recommendation for you as a sort of like the logic order or priority order or taxonomy of decarbonization. First is efficiency conservation. We should reduce the height of the hurdle we have to clear. We should reduce our energy consumption because the energy we don't consume is energy we don't have to clean up after. And that is the first best thing we should do. And thankfully, that's one of the mega trends I told you about, like that's continuing, but maybe we could pick up the pace on that and we'll do more efficiency and conservation. And that's great news. Let's do that. It saves us money. It's resilient. It's robust. It's good for the economy. It's also difficult to invest in. I'm a venture capitalist as well as a professor, and I had a couple different corporate jobs. And I would say that it's hard to find good business models for efficiency to invest in. So it maybe is one of those things that needs policies or codes more than the others. The second priority step is electrification, wherever it makes sense to do so. And electrification makes a lot of sense because we're decarbonizing the power sector in parallel, because the low carbon power sources like wind and solar and eventually geothermal and maybe small modular reactors for nuclear will help us clean up the power sector. So as we electrify other sectors, transportation or industry or building heat or agriculture, we'll get cleanliness benefits for those other sectors, but we will also get efficiency benefits. The most obvious example here is to electrify light duty vehicles, light duty surface transportation. Our cars with a gasoline engine has like a 20% efficiency. The gasoline drivetrain is not efficient. Most of the energy is thrown out the tailpipe as waste heat. With an electric drivetrain, it's 90% efficient. Even if you plug that 90% efficient electric drivetrain with the batteries and motors and everything else into a 30% efficient power plant, which is not unusual, then you still have 27% efficiency. It's still more efficient to have an electric vehicle with an inefficient power plant than it is to have a gasoline engine. You just get so many efficiency benefits. And the same is true for heat pumps for heating and other things. So electrified processes tend to be efficient. And there are a lot of places where it makes a lot of sense. The third step is green fuels or clean fuels for the parts of the economy that are either hard or impossible or intractable or too expensive to electrify. Things like industrial heat or making chemicals or aviation or shipping across the oceans or long-haul trucking, building heat in existing buildings, especially in older buildings in cold climates. There are places where it might not make sense to electrify, and molecules are handy, but those molecules should be cleaner. They could be biomolecules or hydrogen carriers or that kind of thing. And then the last step is carbon management, either with point source carbon capture at the smokestack or the tailpipe, or direct air capture where you scrub it out of the atmosphere wherever you happen to be. The good news about CO2 is it's well mixed around the atmosphere. So removing the CO2 in West Texas is just as handy for the atmosphere as avoiding it or removing it in East Texas where the refineries and pollution is. You don't have to clean it up in the exact same location. That gives us some geographic flexibility. It's quite nice. But that's the order: efficiency, conservation, electrify what you can while decarbonizing the power sector, green fuels, carbon management. That sets up what we need to do to clean up the economy. And that kind of raises this sort of list like, oh, well, what are the critical technologies then? And I think about that as an engineer. Anything that facilitates efficiency is good. Better appliances for sure, but also urban planning and mass transit, work from home policies and universal broadband, setting up transportation lanes so you can take an e-bike or a scooter or something to work. You don't have to drive a huge Tahoe or something to just drive one person to work. And we do it in such a ridiculous way in Texas, and we need to make it easier for people to have the more efficient options. And then anything that facilitates electrification, batteries and storage and vehicles or bulk grid, better data for management, better transmission, high voltage DCs, below ground lines, subsea lines, microgrids, smart grids, you name it. Really clean power. And that could be geothermal or small modular fission reactors, fusion reactors, wind and solar, maybe gas and carbon capture or hydrogen. There's a variety of ways to do low carbon power, especially if it's controllable and dispatchable, will be really great. Then we need green fuels, hydrogen carriers, like I mentioned, carbon management, how we get carbon, how we use the carbon. And then lastly, the circular economy, where we can use the waste streams from one part of the economy as an input to another part. So that's kind of the set of critical technologies of the future. You know, what you'll start to see emerge is that it would be pretty handy for us if we could get really clean, abundant, affordable electrons, which we already have today, but also clean, abundant, affordable molecules that we can use for other purposes, especially if we can get clean, abundant, affordable hydrogen and carbon, or CO2. And then we can start to build a carbon negative future, because it's not just about getting to zero and stopping our pollution. It's about cleaning up the mess that we've been dumping in the atmosphere for 200 years. It's sort of like a leave the world behind in a better place and a better way than you found it. And that's what we need to get to. So if we look at just the world, or just Texas today, we take methane out of the ground and we run it through our infrastructure, run it through a turbine or a boiler or a burner or whatever it is. And we dump the CO2 in the atmosphere. We're taking carbon from the crust into the atmosphere. And in the future, maybe we can take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, use it in a variety of ways, and then take the CO2 up. That's kind of circular. And if we do that, we're leveraging the more than $10 trillion of gas pipelines and compressors and storage tanks and other things we've already built. So you've got a very robust and extensive methane infrastructure in the United States. It'd be cool if we leverage that. And actually around the world, we've got a lot of that. So we don't have to use methane from the ground. We can fabricate it or take it from biogenic sources and that kind of thing. And we could also not dump the CO2 into the atmosphere. We could capture it and put it into the ground, or put it into products, plastics and drywall and cement and aggregate and other things. And that takes us to a carbon negative future, where it's not just about getting to carbon zero of reducing our pollution, but cleaning up the pollution and repurposing it to go carbon negative. Let's do what we can to restore the atmosphere to its more appropriate carbon balance, so we don't have to pick up humanity and move it. That's kind of what I'm trying to avoid here. And a lot of us are working on that. How do we get to carbon zero? How do we get to carbon negative? And fuels are a part of the carbon negative story. And then coming back to my point about energy efficiency and conservation, I think that needs to be the guiding ethic for us. I had this great opportunity about 8 years ago to be in a room with like 40 people with Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time. And I'm actually going to next week to the United Nations again for UN Climate Week. I don't think I'll see the Secretary General, but it was nice to sort of hear him and meet him. And one thing he said in this small room was, use energy and water sparingly. Even a single drop of water is precious. Man, I love that. There's like every drop matters, every electron matters, every molecule matters. And I think that is true. So I think we really should sort of heed that and do what we can with efficiency and conservation, because that avoids so many other problems. And it conveniently works at many scales. It works at many time scales and many geographic scales. We can do conservation today. We can set our thermostat at a particular level in the next 10 minutes and at the scale of a human. We can buy more efficient appliances and cars. So we can do conservation at the scale of, say, a decade. And we can do conservation over many decades or centuries based on the things we've built and how we lay out our cities and what we're building. So from the human individual level to the regional, continental, century level, we can do conservation efficiency. It's remarkably nimble across these different spatial and temporal scales, which is pretty exciting. And importantly, it buys us time. My daughter, Evelyn, who's now 24, a graduate student in music, she and I, when she was a little girl, would brush our teeth together. It was like a father-daughter ritual. And we would get our toothbrush and turn on the water to get it wet, and then turn the water off to brush our teeth, and then turn the water back on to rinse the toothbrush and turn it off. But we would turn the water off while brushing, and that would save, I don't know, a couple gallons of water. And if you do that across every household in America, it starts to make a big difference. And one day I didn't turn off the water fast enough to her liking, and she turned off the water and kind of scowled at me and made a fist and said, "Turn off the water, Daddy. The scientists need time." And I thought that really was a brilliant sort of statement. It really captured the meaning of conservation efficiency, which is, it's not the only answer. It's hard to get to work on efficiency or light your light bulb with efficiency, but it sure does buy us time. And if we buy ourselves time, we can bring better solutions to the forefront. And that's my mission and many others. And many of you on this call probably doing the same thing. And so this is the value of conservation, is the time it buys us. So I think she got it as a kid intuitively. And I think actually most kids get it. You shouldn't be wasteful. And just like keeping that mindset as we get older is a big part of that. And so I'll bring that all together and wrap it up as sort of the big picture of energy, is that energy is in everything. The right way to look at it is through a lens of trade-offs. There's good and bad in every form of technology and fuel that we have out there. So we want to maximize the good and minimize the bad. Energy done the right way is really remarkable. It's amazing. But energy done the wrong way is problematic. We might as well do it the right way. So I'll stop there. I really appreciate your time and attention. And it looks like we have over 15 minutes for Q&A. And love to hear your questions. And I think people put them in the Q&A, so I'll go to them. but also happy to be corrected. So I take questions, corrections, and insults. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. Let me stop share so you just give me, and I'll pull up the Q&A. It looks like we have a lot of questions now. And okay, let's see if I can get them. Oh, great. So one of my college roommates has the first question. And Patricia, should I just get rolling, or do you anything you want to say? Okay. So Ted Skiles, good friend and roommate, says, while we know that you look at a cowboy hat while playing trumpet, can you comment on which resource is more constrained in Texas, water or energy? So in the Longhorn Band, where Ted and I were colleagues, we wear Stetson cowboy hats, which is his reference there. So I appreciate that. And though I was never a very good trumpet player, I was happy to sort of be what we call a third part hero. So I tend to be one of the worst players in the band. In Texas, we have more water constraints than energy constraints. Texas is very energy abundant. We have a lot of oil and gas and coal and heat for geothermal. We have uranium, we have wind, we have sunshine. We even have a lot of offshore resources. We have such incredible energy abundance. So the water constraints are more acute in Texas, because in Texas, we have, well, a freshwater shortage, say. We don't have the right kind of rainfall. Seems like we've been in drought for a long time. And so that's a limitation for us. Sometimes we don't have enough water we need for hydraulic fracturing to get the oil and gas out of the ground or to cool our power plants. Now, if you look at briny water, the salt water below ground, we actually have a lot of brine, a lot of salt water, very large aquifers. And if we found better ways to use that, that might be part of the solution. And we do have the Gulf waters in certain locations. East Texas is very wet, West Texas is very dry, but on average, we don't have that much water. So in Texas, that's the bigger constraint. That's a great question. Next question from Keith. All the current rich developed nations currently have sub-replacement fertility. The population problem in these countries are too few citizens rather than too many. Do you foresee the demographic transitions these countries have undergone replicating worldwide, and therefore relieving the stress on energy development via efficiency demands and population stability or decline? That's a great question. I think of like population declines are most acute right now in Russia and Japan. So there's a few different countries where population has peaked and is dropping. This is a huge challenge for the countries, because as the population declines, it actually gets older too. So you have fewer people who are working age paying for more people who are older. And as people get older, they tend to become more expensive as they require more complicated healthcare and this kind of thing. So this is a huge demographic problem for those countries. There are also countries where they either don't have immigration, well, they don't have immigration either because it's not allowed, like in Japan, or it's not desired, like in Russia. In the United States, we've always made up for this with immigration. We have so many immigration, like immigration is the story of America for hundreds of years. And so we've never really had population problems in the United States because of immigration, but we've moved to an anti-immigration mindset. So immigration slowed down a lot in the United States, and our population growth has slowed, and this is a challenge. So I think that we can solve this if we made it easier for people to move around. Like ideas and culture and currency and goods and services can travel around the world, but people cannot. So I think, well, we can solve this that way. But at the same time, no matter how you calculate it, probably population peaks at some point this century. In this century will probably be the first day in human history where the population on one day is smaller than it was the day before, other than a few blips with like the Black Plague and that kind of thing. So we'll have maybe a slight drop population or a leveling. The estimations are it'll be somewhere between 2050 and 2100. And that'll be fascinating, because if you look at our philosophy of governance and things in the United States and elsewhere, it's always built on a growth mindset, that you need growing population, growing tax base, growing market share, whatever it is, it's growth. And so we have leveling of population. What does that mean for our concepts of the economy and governance? That needs to be very complicated. But from a resource perspective, it might sort of reduce the rate of increasing strain. So it'll be a good news story from that way. So we don't really know how this will play out. Generally, I'm a fan of increasing access to the good life and education for people. So if slowing fertility is a trade-off for that, but you get better quality life for the people alive, I'm fine with that trade-off. But it does raise some important challenges, as you noted. Ben Rosenberg, see your question. You just viewed the slide on carbon dioxide emissions decreasing over the years. How does that correlate with the global warming environmentalist discussion? So the CO2 emissions in the United States have decreased for 15 years in relative and absolute terms. The CO2 emissions have decreased in the UK as well, but globally, CO2 emissions are still growing. And there's not only the growth in CO2, which creates a global issue, and we might not care at some point if we clean up our act, but everyone else is still dirty, we're going to care because we're affected by it. So we have a stake in what other countries do, and we have a stake in that outcome. But the other thing that's happening is there's a big lag. The emissions happen now, but the warming is felt 80 or 100 years later. So there's a massive lag between when you get the thermal effect from when you have the emissions. The warming we're having today is not from the emissions this year, it's from the emissions 50 to 100 years ago, something like that. So it's good news for the United States that we're decreasing our emissions. We're being a good actor. We're getting efficiencies. We're seeing co-benefits of decreasing air pollution and water use and things like that. So we're really benefiting from decreasing our emissions, as is the UK. So I think this is a good story, but also shows the example that you can do it, that we can decrease emissions and grow the economy. So I think it's very important from that perspective. I see a question from Sarah. Sarah, it's good to see your name again. I haven't seen you in human form in a while. It was fun to see you around ETC and elsewhere years ago. Texas's energy usage is expected to increase due to population growth, efficient appliances, electronic usage, that kind of thing. When many current residential solar panel owners refuse to participate in demand-side strategies with Austin Energy, is energy conservation doomed to fail for decarbonization? And is renewable energy going to help us in the future? That's a great question. I think we're going to need both. I think we're going to need more forms of energy. We're going to have more consumption, especially of electricity. Electric growth will grow because we have more electrified processes and electric cars and that kind of thing. So we'll probably build renewables and nuclear and everything else. But we also need demand side management. So what Sarah's asking about is, we have this peak demand issue in Texas. When it gets really hot out, we all turn on our air conditioners. No surprise. That makes the demand really high. Or in the winter, if we have electric heaters, it drives the demand up for heating our homes. And this can really strain the grid. And there's something called demand side management, where we could choose to dial back on our heating or cooling, or work with a partner like Austin Energy or your local utility, whoever your partner is, to turn off your system or rotate off your devices like pool pumps or water heaters, whatever it is, to reduce demand. And that demand side management is the biggest opportunity in Texas we don't leverage. Our peak demand electricity is about 85 gigawatts. We have about 10 gigawatts of demand side potential, where we turn things off or rotate things on and off. And that would be a lot cheaper, cleaner, and faster than building 10 gigawatts of new power plants. But we have limited uptake. It looks like we just have half a gigawatt or so of demand side management in Texas. And Sarah, I think the way you get there is not by having volunteer participation, although I'm a volunteer, but I'm an energy nerd, but pay people. I know people who will drive across town to save $1 on something. And so if you paid people dollars or tens of dollars every afternoon, or whenever it is that you have a peak demand event, they will dial back. People will do a lot for tens of dollars. So I think we can set up a payment scheme where people are paid handsomely to reduce their demand, and it would help prop up the grid and have a lot of value. So I think we need to move from voluntary to paid, and that will help. Question from Michael: what is your view of solar power? Why hasn't wind not taken off more in the US? And same question around nuclear. I would say wind and solar have taken off in the United States. We've had a lot of growth in wind and solar, especially in Texas. Solar in particular is the fastest growing new form of power generation in America today. It has been for 2 or 3 years. And wind was dominant for the 15 years before that, say. So we do have a lot of growth in wind and solar, much more growth here in Texas than in France or other countries. In Texas, we are the 6th largest wind power in the world by installed capacity, 4th largest by wind generation. So the only countries that generate more wind power than Texas are the United States as a whole, China, and I think India might be 3rd, and then Texas. So we are globally relevant for wind and solar in Texas, but the United States, it actually has taken off. I think we'll see it happen more. Nuclear is different. One reason why wind and solar have taken off so rapidly is because they're so cheap and easy to build. You can get a permit, you can build it in 18 months, something like that. Fission has a longer regulatory process. It takes years or decades. It costs more. It gives you a lot of performance benefits you don't get from wind and solar, but it's a slower process, a more expensive process to get it installed. And so with high interest rates and high cost of capital, it's just going to take a while to get done, adding in the regulatory overlays. Fusion is interesting. So all the nuclear we do today in the world's fission. Fusion, where instead of splitting the atoms, you're putting the atoms together, and it gives you sort of a lot of energy without the radioactive waste products you don't want to deal with. Fusion's attracting a lot of private capital, billions of dollars of venture capital for over a dozen fusion startups. Very exciting. I don't think they're anywhere close to power plant status, but that's okay. Even if it takes another decade or so, like we're going to need power a decade or so from now. So fusion's very appealing. And after decades of R&D at the more fundamental level from the US government and national labs, it's exciting to see it attract more private capital. So that's kind of cool. Question from Diana about different chemistries and batteries. Lithium-ion batteries are great. They're pretty cheap. They're high performance. They're fast. But they have thermal runaway, which is a polite word for fires. And they also have some concerns about either where we get the lithium or where the lithium's refined. Sodium's more abundant, more stable. So will the sodium-ion battery ever replace lithium-ion? I don't know if it'll replace it, but it will probably supplement and complement it because it's got a performance features that are very desirable. So that's a good question. Michael, another question asked about wind solar, but what my view on algae. So algae, as a way to absorb carbon produced by steel mills or cement plants and that kind of thing. Is it viable? Yes, it's viable. It can work. It has been shown to work. It's pretty complicated and expensive though. And so I'm not sure. I think we'll want algae for other purposes, maybe to grow some specialty nutraceuticals or to do water cleanup or to get some proteins or lipids, this kind of thing, maybe for animal feed. But as a carbon cleanup, there probably end up being cheaper ways to do it where you get higher performance. At UT, we've got the world's largest collection of algae strains. So UT is a world leader on algae research. So that's a great question. Sarah, another question. Should water be priced higher? I think so. That's very controversial. Actually, it's a mixed answer. I think the first few gallons of water per person per day should probably be free or really cheap. But after that, expensive. And it should be free or cheap for the first few gallons because we need it to live. It's a human right. We need it for hygiene, for showering and washing and doing our clothes and washing our dishes. We need it for cooking. But beyond that, watering our lawns and having a pool, it's luxurious uses. So I think the human rights uses should be really cheap or free, but the luxurious uses should be priced like they are the luxuries. And I pay a lot for water at my house for a variety of legacy reasons. My combined water and wastewater bill is about $150 to $200 a month, which is higher than most people. It's higher than my electric bill, higher than my telecom bill. And so we appreciate the water we have, but most water bills are lower. But I think where I'm paying is probably more accurate to what its actual value is and what its actual costs are. And my wife might be listening. She doesn't even know this. We got a $900 something bill yesterday to repair the grinder pump on our sewer system. So water, I kind of moan when it's expensive, but it probably should be expensive. Jakob, it's good to see your name there and your question. In terms of policy, are the federal dollars supporting the 4 different endeavors aligned with the order you presented on slide 76? Large funds going into carbon capture, maybe versus the efficiency improvements or electrification. Great question, Jakob. So what's interesting about the United States is we have several different policy initiatives. We have the CHIPS Act, which is bipartisan. We have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is bipartisan. And then we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which was partisan. We have a variety of different acts that are really putting money into developing different solutions. And it's like manufacturing policy and industrial policy. And it's mostly a good news story that it makes Washington, D.C. relevant to policymaking again in a way that I think is very positive. And it's really accelerated a lot of these industries and created this battery belt of manufacturing jobs in rural areas and other things. So I think it's pretty exciting from an energy perspective. It does not align with my priority order, though. And that's very American to ignore efficiency and conservation. If you look at U.S. Department of Energy investments over like a 20-year period, it'll be like 80% on new forms of energy or new supply and 20% on conservation efficiency. And the Inflation Reduction Act was mostly about new forms of supply as well. So I think it doesn't really align with my priority order. The other thing is the Inflation Reduction Act really focuses on carbon capture and hydrogen and then maybe batteries. So it might even be going in reverse order. But the politics of carbon capture and hydrogen are very powerful because that's where you get the most synergies with oil and gas industries and workers and the most sort of labor justice and that kind of thing. So it was good politics. I'm not sure it's great energy policy, though. We'll see how it shakes out. Most of the politicians have voted against, like the entire Republican Party voted against it, but almost all the developments happening in Republican districts, by the way. So we'll see how that shakes out in the 2024 presidential election. And Patricia, quick time check. And my clock says I got 2.5 minutes to go. And
That's about it.
I'm not gonna get to all the questions, but do you need any time or can I just go? And
I just need about 35 seconds.
Okay, I'm gonna go like another minute and a half and then hand it over to you. Okay, so a question from John. Does it bother you as much as it bothers me that big carbon users buy carbon credits? It's like a free but expensive pass, like a hall pass. The company should be making a better effort to clean up their practices. This is a great point. So the question John's asking about is about carbon offsets. I can fly on Qantas Airways to Australia and I can pay for an offset if I want to. Not everyone does, but some people might find that interesting. Big consumers, which could be refineries, but also could be data centers like Microsoft and others, can offset or pay to offset their CO2. The criticism is, actually, it's not really offsetting the CO2. What they'll do is someone will say, I'm going to burn down a forest. But if you pay me, I won't burn it down. And therefore, I avoided all the CO2 emissions in this kind of, it's like, is it carbon avoidance or is it extortion? It's not really clear, but it doesn't really seem to work. So carbon offsets, I think, aren't working. Like the jury's out. Or if you plant trees to remove CO2, the trees can go up in flames. So Bill Gates and Microsoft, I think, invested in a lot of tree planting for CO2 removals. but then there was a forest fire, the trees burned, the CO2 wasn't removed, it was released into the atmosphere. So what do you do then? I think it'd be better to pay for carbon removals, not carbon offsets. The carbon avoidances are harder to quantify, but actual removal where you actually scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere and you bury it below ground and turn it into rock like they do in Iceland, that works. And there are people doing that. Stripe and others are building funds to pay for removals, even though it's like $1,000 a ton or $600 a ton to do the removals. And that's much better than the offsets because it's actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I think that's the future. And I can talk about that all day long. And I have to stop. Patricia, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone. And I'll turn it over to you so you can make your sort of closeout comments.
Well, thank you for being with us today. It was a wonderful lecture. We had tons of questions, great engagement. So really appreciate you. And to the audience, thank you so much for being with us today. Just a quick reminder that our next month, we have a lunchtime lecture on October 10th, and it's called The New China. That will be held in person at the Alumni Center on Tuesday, October 10th. So you can find more information and register right now at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. Thank you again, and y'all have a wonderful week.